Our next speaker is Magnus Bray from miiCard.
Hi, good evening. Tonight I'd like to give you an introduction to miiCard. I've already done an introduction through some work with Eddie last year, so I won't recap the same thing again. This time we'll go through a bit of a case study of a business using miiCard for identity verification. And also hopefully tonight go into as much detail about miiCard as we do about identity and get everybody to think a little bit about identity and what we mean. So I guess it's 20 years since the phrase was termed on the internet, "Nobody knows you're a dog," basically created in New Yorker just at the time the internet was starting to get people to think about anonymity and the way it can be used. 20 years on from there, it's probably still quite difficult today to actually be able to prove identity correctly. So in many ways, the services we receive, the way we think about the internet has changed, but actually from an identity and trust perspective, we haven't necessarily moved on that much further. There's great things we would like to be able to do online, to be able to give people control of their identity. We'll talk a little bit about what we mean by that in a second, but allow you to assert your identity, control how your identity is shared, allow businesses to be able to accept that identity so you can do high value services online. Certainly we can make small value payments, we can interact online, but actually there's a huge amount of high value services we still need offline processes for because the identity isn't there. miiCard does a lot of those things. The way we do that from a consumer-centric perspective is different to a lot of identity services. We create a bring your own identity, if you like, for the consumer to be able to take their identity with them like a digital passport and assert that on sites that accept the miiCard itself. All of that's done purely online. At the moment, we're across 10 different countries, and I'll go into a little bit more about that in a second. But first, I'd like to think about identity itself and what's in the market for people looking for identity services. Generally, there's a few ways to do things. We can begin with different types of social accounts, email accounts, things like Facebook, Hotmail, etc. We can move up the scale into thinking about asking people questions about themselves. Questions, be that things you'd commonly understand, like your name, address, your date of birth, things that are more personal to you, like your mother's maiden name. And then we get into more detailed questions, which are more difficult to find out, like how you pay your utility bills, etc., and other out-of-wallet questions, as they be called. The challenge with all of those methods is that that information's been shared. So whether it's my passport number, my driver's license number, any of those attributes that in some ways seem personal to me, when we come to look at it from an identity perspective, the fact that they've been shared undermines them greatly when it comes to trust. Because when we get to a position of proof, and somebody says, well, it was definitely Magnus that asserted his identity online, we go, okay, how do we know that? Well, they asked me how I pay my utility bill, what my mother's maiden name was, what my shoe size was, so on and so forth. All of those things may be unique to me, but I'm not necessarily the only person who could have easy access to them. Or they're self-asserted and made up, my favorite color, and so on and so forth. We have no trust in that information. And that's where the real problem comes when we come to proving identity online. To get into what miiCard does in a second, we take a different view of how we prove identity. And to do that, we think about identity, I guess, is what it's supposed to be thought about in the offline world. And what's the purpose of your identity? When we get into commerce, we can get into contracts. The purpose for identity is to provide accountability and traceability to me as a physical person. So if I'm in the room right now and I undertake a contract with somebody, and it's a physical service for a physical payment, there's a huge amount of control on that contract because both parties can control the services and the payment, regardless of what my name, address, date of birth, and so on and so forth is. So that contract is established and trusted. It's when we move to a remote position that we really need identity. We need trust in that identity, not just because we need the data from it, but we actually need the conceptual trust. If we get to a court of law, how do we know it was me that asserted that identity, it was me that entered that contract? The challenge with the model I described in the data model is that obviously we reach that endpoint, and one party says, well, it was obviously Magnus because of his data. The other party says, well, yeah, actually, anybody else could have told you that. Any of 10,000 people in a contact center, anybody I've paid money to using my bank details, anything like that. So what miiCard does is miiCard removes the need to use data to prove identity. We also avoid things like using document scans for exactly the same reason that my documents have been shared elsewhere. Most of the information in them can be shared, guessed, and you can easily create a document scan. So what miiCard does to prove identity is miiCard leverages some of the things we talked about by Jonathan. We use account aggregation. We use the process of the individual logging into their online bank account to prove they are who they say they are. because that process of accessing your online bank account relies on you having a secure credential. That secure credential isn't a data attribute. It's not something that's shared by you openly. It's something that you assert like a key with your bank. So miiCard's looking at that process and saying, hold on a minute, we don't need to see what the actual password is. We don't store that as evidence that you are you. What we need to say is, can you open your account door? If you can open the door to your account and the key is the only thing that can do that, you must have had the key, and so on and so forth. So with miiCard, from a perspective of trust, we're thinking about the value of that in the contract sense, rather than just thinking about identity as a set of data attributes, which from a privacy perspective, from general consumer information, everybody's encouraged to think about their identity as their data, and is actually much, much more valuable than that. It's your identity plus your trust. When we look at the identity service in a bit more detail, we actually break it up into 3 areas, because although I've gone on about trust and the importance of it, it's not just trust. You need those things bound together to trust the data about you, and of course, as some people in the audience know, security, the security around that identity. So those 3 parts are important, be it called authentication, whatever else, the thing that secures that identity. It's interesting when we break them down to 3 parts, because then we begin to think about the thing that makes me traceable as a physical person, the information about me that's wrapped up in that process, and then how do I control that? So to take some examples of that, the miiCard policy engine sits in the middle for the relying parties. So each business that wants to consume the identity sets the policy, sets their level of assurance. What I've described is just an example of a configuration for miiCard. We do an awful lot more of that when we get into detail. The trust initially with miiCard comes from the bank. It doesn't need to come from the bank. In the US, we're talking to a government agency about doing physical checks to give someone a miiCard. That would work. It provides a different level of traceability, a different level of risk, but it's still up to the relying party to say they'd like to accept either a physical check or recognition of ownership of a bank account. We use traditional data sources, as everybody else does today, to prove information about Magnus as an individual. So the data bureaus, as everyone would know them. We can also allow the individuals to plug in things like Facebook and so on and so forth to bring more data in about them. Because again, we see the difference between the data about you and the trust. But binding those 2 things together make them obviously very valuable. Finally, security takes on different aspects. At a minimum, we use SMS text messages to secure the mobile phone and the individual session when they assert their identity to a second factor of strong authentication. But also we could include things like location-aware services we have already. We could extend out to biometrics. Bearing in mind your fingerprint doesn't prove your identity, because the first time that you assert your identity with the relying party, in this case, with the new organization, unless they know that it's your fingerprint, they don't know it's you. And so the reason for going to this detail with this audience tonight is that usually I find when we're describing miiCard, the biggest challenge is describing what identity is and what the value is that's in identity. Most of the questions we get back are about security and data, missing out the aspect of trust, which is the thing that we need to get to be able to do high-value transactions online. Just a little bit about how that can work inside applications. So we've just got a few screens up here. I hope you can see that in the back. Basically, the miiCard service itself is just embedded inside what we call a relying party inside the customer website. The individual goes through the process of either using their existing miiCard, signing in with it like you would with a Facebook account, but with much more security than that behind it for strong authentication. But presuming you don't have the miiCard set up, you go through a process of 2 or 3 forms, which takes your data. We do strong authentication, email and SMS. We get you to put in your personal data about address and so on and so forth. And then we ask you to select your bank, already knowing which country you're in. You log into your online bank account. We do a check against that. And then the final part is very, very important, again, from an identity assertion perspective. miiCard, because it's a digital passport, is completely passive. We can't do anything without the user consent. But really importantly, we don't want to. Otherwise, you don't have traceability to the physical person. So the contract, to me, as the real person, gets broken if we go into the old data model of doing data lookups. So the miiCard system requires the individual to do something, in this case, click Allow Access. At the same time, we show a set of claims that the relying parties asked for. Of course, that changes for every company and depending on what data they want. So we pass that identity through. Now, keeping in mind here on this claims page, there isn't any bank details. Because of course we're not requiring the individual to share any data because we've done that in the miiCard process. Before the individual can get to this stage, they need to reach that level of assurance. And in principle, miiCard support trusted pseudonyms, so the individual can assert their identity without sharing any data whatsoever. Once that happens, they're back into the process and off they go, in this case, finishing account application. A few screens from the Bring Your Own Identity itself, so miiCard's up and running. People can go and try and sign up for it if they'd like to. You can just do that through miicard.com. Once you do that, you get a control panel for your identity. Nobody asks for this at the moment. Because again, people are so used to thinking about the data, not about the power and the value of the identity assertion. So in here, the user can go in, you can control where you verify, you can choose new banks to do that with, you can add in more social account information, you can select the type of security you want around your miiCard. So we leave everything in the hand of the consumer as a starting point as to how they want to treat those aspects of their identity. So all of that is open to you as a user. And all of that falls in line with a lot of the new EU privacy protection and data policies around giving consumer consent. We took that decision a while ago, and I guess we gamble that would be the position, that actually the citizen or the user would be at the center of identity and data. And so we give that control to them in a practical way. I'll just run quickly through a case study in the last 4 minutes. This is a case study from the US. It's a Bitcoin company called BTC Quick. They are raising money at the moment and looking to be seen as a genuine regulated financial institution. So they selected miiCard because it shows the regulated, not only are they trying to do their KYC properly, but actually they're trying to tie into the regulated system, because of course a miiCard user requires a bank account. So they're leveraging that in a specific way for themselves. The problem they had was that they had a lot of chargeback fraud. They were doing data checks and document scans. The outcome and the results of that was that over a few hours they implemented the miiCard API, which just pulls into their process, and now they give their options, their users an option either to use the miiCard or upload documents. They charge them if they want to upload documents because of the cost of having to do it. It's free if the user wants to use a miiCard, plus they get to double the transaction level in the first session. They implemented that in a few days. They put their chargeback level to 0 in the first month and got the return on investment back. So again, that's a specific case that worked well for us. Just a couple of slide shots. Nothing really had to change about BTC Quick or its processes. miiCard's just part of that. We don't force the user into it. There's not a lot of point in doing that. But certainly the user can go in on this screen and either choose to do documents and data if they want to. BTC Quick aren't going to take the same trust in the identity, so they have a lower transaction level and they charge them some money to do it, but they're not forcing them down the miiCard route if they don't want to. And as I mentioned, the coverage today is across those 10 countries where we have the integrations to the banks. So in the UK, it's about 90% coverage of the online banking population. We do account aggregation into all the 5 high street banks. And that's it. Any questions?
A quick question for you.
Yes.
It's essentially around phishing. Have you considered phishing, and what would be the threat model for you?
We have, and it's an incredibly technical answer to my CTO, I'll be better positioned to answer it correctly for you, but certainly the security methods that we put in place have already gone through all the UK banks, well, 2 of the UK banks already. We're speaking to them about them being our customers. What we actually look at is strong authentication before the individual's allowed to go and do the bank assertion. So one of the challenges for the user that we require is the user has to use the out-of-browser authentication before they're able to go through the bank process. It doesn't mean you're going to automatically stop the phishing. It just adds another layer. And I think in all of these questions, whether it's around the identity proof, whether it's around the security or the data, each answer on its own is often reasonably frail. It's when you combine all of them together in a process that actually you get the value out of any single point. Sorry, that wasn't more technical, but yeah.
Who, apart from the banks and the financial institutions, do you foresee becoming your major clients?
Thank you very much. That's a great question. Actually, I didn't really mean the banks in the first instance to be my customers. My customers I expect to be anybody who wants a level of trust. So at the moment, we've seen, I guess on one side of the spectrum, social networks, not the big one we all know about, Unfortunately, not yet. But social networks looking to give users more security when they're interacting with people, dating sites, that kind of thing. Moving up through to business networks, sharing IP. Moving into pre-employment screening. With one of the big banks now, we're going into their supply chain, looking at the contractors, not because we can prove right to work, but because we can prove the identity of the individual and provide much more traceability. So when they look down their supply chain, if someone's got a miiCard and provided a photocopy of a visa or a passport to show they can work, there's much less risk in that, much more traceability to a person. So from an audit perspective, they'll target the people who don't do that. Moving up the value chain, I think government, healthcare are huge areas, obviously, where identity is required, and then obviously back into finance again. But particularly, I think, high-value transactions. So I think one thing is that miiCard isn't an answer to everything. It's only an answer where you need the level of trust. We do get business customers coming along saying, I need to prove identity, there's a compliance requirement. I say, well, what's your level of risk, or what's your level of fraud, or what's your level of damage if you get it wrong? They say nothing. I say, well, go and use data checks and photo ID scans. They're efficient, they're effective, they get the compliance bit done. There's arguments about how far up the risk chain they go, but I certainly know as a risk proposition, we provide a stronger solution. So we very much leave it up to them in all those spectrums.
How about contract signature, and do you have any case studies on that?
Not yet, but we are working on development with a big signature company, which is around doing contract signatures, but mostly for the consumer or non-corporate environment, where they don't rely on the corporate identity, if you like, for the signature, but actually rely on the individual. So that will be coming quite soon, hopefully in the next 3 months. I think in a way, depending on different solutions, we have another solution that actually does their own e-signature and uses the miiCard as the trust into that. But I think getting it more mainstream is where we want to get to in the next 3 months for that. But it's certainly an area where, again, the whole value of the accountability to the individual is the thing that counts from the contract perspective, not the fact that somebody knew my data. Just doesn't get far enough.
Okay, last question.
Hi, I'm Avinash from Cards Prepaid Limited. Of other things, we are a prepaid program manager. So my question was whether miiCard can act as a replacement for traditional KYC services for banks. So for example, let's say an online bank would want to onboard a client. Rather than providing, let's say, scans of their ID documents, would the bank be able to just accept a miiCard identity and onboard a customer based on that?
Absolutely, yes, but it is up to the individual bank and their own policy. So generally, when we go to the organisation looking at their onboarding policy, there's two things that are often confused in the organisation. One is risk, and the other is compliance. We can be both compliant, but we also provide a risk solution. Separating those conversations is often the challenge of getting to that answer in any individual customer, but absolutely yes. Just to add, there's nothing particularly new that we do here. Everything that we're doing actually leverages existing techniques, be it acting as a notary, be it leveraging multiple data sources. So from the existing KYC non-face-to-face verification perspective, there's nothing particularly new.
Okay, Magnus, thank you very much.